what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about the European context, the human rights system in Europe, and also the role of the European Union. You can never simply transplant one system from one jurisdiction to another. Nevertheless, it is possible to learn about how similar challenges have been faced in other jurisdictions. But very briefly, there are 28 member states of the European Union, although some of those states although they're not federal states, or mostly are not federal states, but nevertheless, some of those states have more than one jurisdiction. Indeed, my own country, the United Kingdom, has 3 different legal jurisdictions. But there are 28 members of the European Union, but when we come to the European Convention on Human Rights, there are 47 countries that have signed up to the European Convention, ranging from Portugal in the west through to Russia in the east. And most of those European states have an inquisitorial tradition, and only a very few have a common law tradition. Lovely. So only a very few have a common law tradition, primarily the United Kingdom and Ireland and a couple of other states as well. So we have this complexity in Europe in terms of the legal traditions, in terms of criminal procedure. And importantly, that is something which both the European Court of Human Rights and indeed the European Union has to be able to deal effectively with. Let me just say something very briefly about the European Convention on Human Rights. So if we just take 2 of the articles from the European Convention, which are particularly relevant to criminal procedure, that is Article 5, the right to liberty, and Article 6, the right to fair trial. See the provisions of Article 5, then you will see that they are reflected in a very similar fashion in the American Convention on Human Rights. So, for example, here in Article 5, there can be no deprivation of liberty except inter alia for the purpose of bringing a person before a court on reasonable suspicion of having committed an offence. Secondly, an arrested person must be promptly informed of the reasons for arrest. And thirdly, an arrested person must be promptly produced before a court. Well, those all figure in the American Convention as well. And then if we move on to Article 6, the right to fair trial, well, again, that is reflected in the American Convention. So everyone is entitled to a fair and public hearing within a reasonable time. And everyone charged with the criminal offence has the right to defend himself or herself in person or through legal assistance of their own choosing, or if they have insufficient means, to be given it free when the interests of justice so require. And so what we find in Article 6, or this part of Article 6, is that there are in particular 2 principles. First of all, the right of suspects and accused persons to have a lawyer, and secondly, the right to be provided with a lawyer free if they have insufficient means to pay for the lawyer themselves, and if it is in the interest of justice that they be legally represented. So again, that is pretty closely reflected in the American Convention on Human Rights as well. And just to take that a little bit further, under the European system, the provisions of the European Convention are interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights. There is very extensive European Court of Human Rights case law on the right of access to a lawyer. But I just wanted to point 2 things out because, in particular, the first of these has not been easy from the point of view of many member state governments. And what the European Court of Human Rights has held in many cases is that the right to a lawyer applies throughout criminal proceedings. Well, that's not exceptional. But what they have decided is that that right of access to a lawyer starts at the time, this is their expression, at the time when the situation of the suspect has been substantially affected. The European Court had to find a common formula for describing the situation in which rights, including the right of access to a lawyer, first arise. And what the European Court has said is that what is important is not the way in which that situation is described in domestic law. What is important is the de facto situation, whether the person has actually been deprived of their liberty, whether that person has actually experienced, is in a situation where their position is substantially affected. And what that means, therefore, is that the European Court of Human Rights has decided that the right of access to a lawyer doesn't simply arise on arrest or detention, but that at the very latest it will arise when a person is, in a practical sense, deprived of their liberty, however that is actually described in the legislation of that country, and including situations where they are deprived of their liberty unlawfully. But it also means that a person may well be entitled to access to a lawyer even in the absence of being deprived of their liberty. So, for example, if a person is suspected by the police of having committed a criminal offence, and the police are investigating that offence, and they interview that person as a suspect, but without arresting them, then they are still entitled to access to a lawyer by virtue of Article 6 of the European Convention. But as I say, the important thing is not the way in which that deprivation of liberty is described in domestic law. The important thing is, what's the actual factual situation? Are they deprived of their liberty or not? The second point on there is about the right to legal aid, the right, in effect, to state support for the costs of having a lawyer. I won't spend much time on that at all, but what the European Court of Human Rights has done is to, rather than to define precisely when the right to legal aid applies, it has set out the criteria which must be taken into account in any signatory state for determining whether a person should be eligible for state support for the cost of legal assistance. So let me just briefly talk about some of the things that we found in research in Europe. Now, the first relates to the administration of legal aid, whereas most of Europe has taken what is sometimes called the judicare approach, whereby private lawyers are funded through a legal aid mechanism to provide legal assistance for those people who cannot afford to pay for it themselves. However legal services are delivered or administered for those people who cannot afford to pay for them themselves, it always requires efficient organisation, which is a non sequitur. It's sort of obvious, but often is not the case. But it also requires either public defender organisations or legal aid organisations that understand the importance of legal aid and are committed to delivering it efficiently and effectively. And if we look around the world, that is not always the case. A second challenge is about ensuring that suspects and defendants know their rights and understand the significance of those rights. The police, if they are permitted to, will use the provision of information about procedural rights in a strategic way which they think favours them, or they regard as being in their interests. But there are other problems with the provision of information about procedural rights. which included a written notice of rights, which was simply an extract of legislation, which clearly was not designed to enable a suspect who's not trained in the law to understand what it meant. And then a third thing, which also is common on both continents and probably around the world, is what we call rights avoidance mechanisms. This is a whole range of practices in most jurisdictions where the police will adopt a particular strategy to try to avoid a suspect having procedural rights, particularly at the early stages of the criminal process. In some jurisdictions, this is particularly prevalent. The police will take someone off the street, take them somewhere, possibly to a police station, but not record the fact that they have detained that person. Associated with that is what you might politely call informal interviewing. So, interviewing a person outside of what the law provides and in the absence of the legal protections that the law provides. A third strategy, common again across many European jurisdictions, is the police treating people who are in truth suspects, but treating them as if they were witnesses. Not because they are witnesses, because indeed they are suspects, but because that is a way of avoiding their procedural rights, such as the right of access to a lawyer. And then another example of these kinds of strategies is where a suspect has exercised their right of access to a lawyer, the police failing to inform the lawyer of the time that they're going to conduct the interview, or conducting an interview at a time when they know the lawyer cannot be there. And that is also a common practice in some jurisdictions in Latin America. And just before I leave that, I think one of the general points which is relevant to both the European situation and the Latin American situation is that if you are wanting to change that, then one of the first things that is necessary is to understand why they do that. What are the imperatives? What are the pressures? What is the culture of the police or the prosecutor which leads them to take that kind of rights avoidance action? So this is a further challenge, is delivering legal aid services when and where they are needed. Now, in most jurisdictions, Latin American or otherwise, a person who's been arrested and detained by the police has a right of access to a lawyer. But the majority of such people do not have access to a lawyer for a range of reasons, but one of them is that legal aid services, whether under a judicare system or whether under a public defender service system, they are not organised in such a way as to be able to provide legal assistance at short notice on a 24/7 basis. Sometimes simply lack of resources, but sometimes a lack of organisation, which is designed to deliver a 24/7 service at short notice. And then the second bullet point is a reference to something I've already mentioned, which is about the need, it's a challenge, which is the need to ensure that professional cultures and practices respect the right to a lawyer and respect procedural rights more generally. And then the final bullet point is, and it is a challenge, is about the need for clarity about the role of criminal defense lawyers, whether they're public defenders or private lawyers, clarity about their role, about their independence, but also about their quality. And one of the things that I would say we found in Europe in relation to the quality of lawyers is that bar associations are very bad, we have found in Europe, at ensuring quality. When it comes to quality, bar associations operate more like a trade union than they do a professional association. And what they tend to do is to protect their members rather than to ensure that their members do a competent, if not good quality job. And that is something which some lawyers and some bar associations, that is a message they do not like to hear. I have almost been shouted down by the president of one of the European bar associations for having the cheek to say that they did not do a good job. But that is the reality. And if that is the reality, then other mechanisms have to be found to ensure quality. We published Effective Criminal Defence in Europe just at the time when the European Union had decided that it needed to do something to ensure common standards across Europe in terms of the way in which suspects and accused people are treated. And so in 2009, they adopted what is called the European Union Roadmap of Procedural Rights. And the idea behind the roadmap is that the European Union should pass a series of pieces of legislation concerned exclusively with the procedural rights of suspects and accused people in the criminal justice systems. And one of the relevant things to know about the European Union is that if it makes a law, and the law in this context is called a directive, but if it adopts a directive, then each member state must make the changes necessary to law and practice in order to comply with that directive. And if they fail to do so, that can be challenged in the Court of Justice of the European Union. And that's one way in which the EU, in some ways, works more effectively than the European Convention on Human Rights, because in some respects, its law is more enforceable than the rights set out in the Convention. And I just wanted to give you a brief indication of the kinds of laws that the European Union has adopted. This was the second directive. The first directive adopted was on the right to interpretation and translation. The second directive was on the right to information in criminal proceedings. And that included the right to be informed about procedural rights, the right to be informed of the evidence, and the right of access to documents which are in the possession of the prosecution. Now, it wouldn't be appropriate to go through this in detail, but let me just point out one or two things. So firstly, and this is the first bullet point there, it provides that suspects and accused people must be informed of their procedural rights promptly in a language that they understand. And you take the second bullet point, if that person has been arrested or detained, they must be given that notification of rights in writing. In the European jargon, it's called a letter of rights. And that letter of rights must be in simple and understandable language. The third directive in the series, which is a directive on the right of access to a lawyer. Now, as I've said, there is a lot of European Court of Human Rights case law on this, but it was evident from the research that we've carried out and other research that's been carried out that the case law of the European Court of Human Rights was not being complied with in quite a lot of European jurisdictions. And so the EU directive on the right of access to a lawyer is very important because it sets out in very clear terms what member states must do in terms of ensuring that their law provides. And so if I just take three parts of that directive, each member state must provide for a right of access to a lawyer from the first stage of police questioning, and that means before they are ever questioned by a police officer, and that applies irrespective of whether the person is deprived of their liberty. Secondly, and this needed saying in very clear terms because a number of countries do not allow this, it provides for a right of a suspect to have a lawyer present during police interrogations. Now that is quite a challenge for some countries. Some have already changed their law to comply with that, and others are trying to resist it. So that's just something very briefly about both the challenges that we have faced and are facing in Europe. And I wanted to go through that because I wanted really to be able to say that, Latin America, of course, its history, its problems, its challenges are particular to Latin America and particular to individual jurisdictions. And in that sense, they are unique. But in another sense, the challenges that you face here are very similar to the challenges that are faced elsewhere. And I would like to think that you can take some comfort from that, because progressive changes have been made and are being made and will be made in the future. And actually, what will happen in Mexico, I hope, will mean that you will be part of a progressive movement which is not just in Mexico, not just in Latin America, and indeed not just in Europe either, because for a variety of reasons, other parts of the world and governments in other parts of the world are having to take similar kinds of actions. So I would just like to finish on this one quotation. And this comes from an international instrument that you may or may not have heard of. And it is the United Nations Principles and Guidelines on Access to Legal Aid in Criminal Justice Systems. Now, these principles and guidelines are non-binding, but they were approved by the UN General Assembly in December of 2012. And I'm happy to say that, unlike my own government, which ignores it, some governments are taking these UN principles and guidelines very seriously. And Principle 1 of the UN Principles and Guidelines says this about legal aid, but I think it also applies to effective criminal defense. So this is the quotation. Legal aid is an essential element of a functioning criminal justice system that is based on the rule of law, a foundation for the enjoyment of other rights, including the right to fair trial, and an important safeguard that ensures fundamental fairness and public trust in the criminal justice process. As I say, I think that applies to effective criminal defense as well, and I think that provides us a good way of thinking about the subject of today's conference. Thank you.